strategist for the Millennial Mega Mashup event, and I'll be your moderator for today's presentation. Our featured speakers today are Howe, founding partner and president, Life Course Associates, and Katz, chief architect of Ypulse. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the event using the chat feature on your screen, and we will reserve time to answer them. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible during the Q&A portion. This session will be recorded and archived so that you can refer to it after the live seminar. We will be sending you a link following the seminar where you can retrieve the archive file. With that said, I'd like to hand it over to Katz of Ypulse.
Thanks, Michelle. Hi, everyone. I'm Katz of Ypulse, and I'm here today with Howe. And we're going to make this very conversational, so please chime in with questions as we go along. And we're going to be focusing on a lot of different topics today, covering a lot of territory, so please stick with us. And I'm going to kick it off from here. Neil, you've written a lot about and talked about a lot of different generations. I'm personally curious, what's your favorite generation to study?
Well, you know, lately, Jake, I've really been into Generation X.
Uh-oh.
I mean, they're endlessly fascinating, and they're picaresque, they're resilient, they're individualistic, and I just can't get enough of all of those History Channel shows with the ice road truckers and Dangerous Catch and swamp loggers. They've all got a share. They were all going for the main chance. They're all getting dirty, and they're all kind of gnarly, and how can you not love that?
Yeah,
so
there's even that jousting one.
Yeah.
They jousted horses against each other, and they knock each other off the horses.
Oh yeah, to see how it really happened. To see how, taking historical things and making it really happen. So
yeah.
I just think, and it's interesting too when you think about generations. Each generation has certain strengths and attributes. And in terms of just color, adventure, and excitement, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to say Gen X.
All right. Hoping to disappoint too many people besides myself.
I know, you millennials thought you were so special.
So that's fantastic. We're going to hone in for a bit on millennials because we are here today to talk about the Millennial Mega Mashup in May 7th, Miami. We'll get back to details on that. I'm personally, I want to get into this idea of multi-generational households.
Yes.
So there's been a lot of shifts in how people are living based on recent economic events. There's this new idea of a multi-generational household. What are your thoughts?
Well, obviously the recent Great Recession hugely increased the share of young people living with their parents. But this actually has been a long trend. It's been even long. It's been around longer than millennials. It really started with late wave boomers in the 1970s. People talked about extended adolescence, and that's when we began to notice more and more young people living long with their parents. It hugely ramped up among Xers, largely for economic reasons. That was the whole famous boomerang phenomenon, where you retreated in disgrace back home because you couldn't make it. You had to go back and live with the rents, And that continued on, particularly that was big in the early 90s in the recession. It's continued with millennials, but I will say this, that the difference is millennials don't mind living with their parents as much, and that's one of the biggest shifts we've seen. Millennials, for example, continuing to live with their parents even after they get full-time jobs, because they can save money and save up for their mortgage, do constructive things. But clearly it increased again with the recent recession. If you look at, according to the recent examination of census data by Pew, back in 1980, at its low point, 11% of 25 to 35-year-olds were living with their parents. Now it's 22%, so it's a full doubling. And obviously it's even larger for people in their early 20s.
So you said 22% of millennials are living with their parents?
25 to 34 age bracket.
Wow.
So that's kind of late wave, early wave millennials and actually late wave Xers. It's even higher if you go down, obviously, in your early 20s, people just coming out of college.
That's so 1 in 5. That's amazing.
Well, I mean,
Isn't. I think which has been part of, there's been a lot of debate, is that there's a delayed, launching that into adulthood, or are they being strategic and, staying at home and saving up a nest egg?
Well, that gets to the whole question of whether it's good or bad. And you find a lot of people around saying it's bad. But I really don't see it that way. First of all, throughout most of human history, and in fact all of American history up until right after World War II, we had very large shares of young adults living at home. That was the norm. In fact, it was much higher than it is today throughout the Great Depression and all the way up till around 1946, 47, 48. Then we built the suburbs, the interstate highways, and we suddenly had a booming economy for young adults, and began the emergence of the so-called nuclear family. So the greatest generation, then the silent generation. The silent generation, people today mostly in their 70s, probably lived outside of multi-generational homes more than any other generation in American history. Because after the silent, we went back to boomers, where it started going the other way again.
Right.
So probably in the late 1950s, early 60s, you had the zenith of people living independently from each other. Or I should say young adults marrying at an early age and getting careers and being financially self-sufficient in an early age. But the other point is this, is that I don't see there's anything wrong with young adults getting along well with their parents. And I'll also say that if you look at one of the largest, most intractable political and economic challenges facing America over the 21st century, which is the aging of America and the enormous unfunded liability costs for Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all of this stuff. What could be more of an opportunity to solve these problems than a world in which adult generations are actually living with or near each other again and can actually personally help each other to take some of the burden off these third-party cash transfer payments? You know what I mean? How could this not be positive? And throughout history, you will hear these moralists, issuing Jeremiah century after century about how bad this age is because kids are turning their back on their parents, right? And finally we have a generation that's not turning their back on their parents, and people are saying, oh, that's terrible. I mean, you can't win.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. And you were saying before, which I found interesting, that perhaps the idea of parents giving their kids loans and kind of helping them through this tough time could be the new normal.
It's not going to end. Interestingly, one of the things we found that parents continue to pay for their kids even after they live home is cell phone bills.
Yeah,
they cover the
family plan.
because the parents want to keep in touch with them, right?
Yeah.
So they want to pay for that to make it really easy.
Right.
But the other thing that's happening now is there's been a huge decline in young adults buying new homes. So what's happening is that parents are taking the place. They're either co-signing the mortgages or they are actually giving the mortgages to the kids. And you have a lot of boomers, maybe in their 50s and 60s. Right now, they can put their money in CDs and get, I don't know, what is it? It's 0.25% interest or something horrible.
Something small.
Or you can make money and give a mortgage to your own kid. Make some money there. So,
yeah. So the best new boomer mutual fund is actually their kids.
Their own kids. But the point is this: one thing we've seen, and MetLife has shown this in some of its recent work, and that is that increasingly we're going to see financial service companies offer services to the entire multi-generational family. You got the silent or boomer generation grandparent who often has all the assets right today, and then you've got maybe a Gen Xer and maybe late wave millennial kids, and it's the older generation that's funding the vacations, the family retreats, often paying for colleges for the third generation down. And so why not design packages that take that whole,
Right. That reach the whole family.
Exactly, and do the whole, and deal with succession issues and tax issues and inheritance issues, do the whole package.
That's a great insight. So I think, let's shift gears a bit. This idea, there's been so much talk of millennials. It's been such a buzzword in the past couple of years. And then here comes the recession, boom. So it's almost like millennials reassessed. Where are they now? Let's talk for a minute about a generation that you, as well as everybody else who's focused on this cohort, has described as optimistic, particularly socially aware, and very shiny and bright. So what happens when those attributes get, sideswiped by a recession as they enter adulthood? How's that going to affect them? What can we expect to see? I mean, would we still say millennials are still this optimistic, positive generation?
Well, it's interesting. It definitely has dimmed their enthusiasm for participation in politics. I mean, we know that, and it's also not notched down, ratcheted down their trust in the system along with other generations, by the way. They still are more trusting than older people, but it's knocked everyone down. But I would say on the personal level, whatever survey we look at, personally, millennials still have that confidence.
Mm-hmm.
They still think they can get their perfect career, and they can get that single perfect employer that they're looking for. They may be living at home, they may be going back to college, they may be doing a temp job at a restaurant, whatever they're doing is a holding pattern, but they still think they can get there. I see very little of the try your second or third choice option, which is
Right.
much more common. I remember among Xers, back when kids, were all dressed in black, back in the early 90s, where it's much more this feeling of, you got to just try something
Right.
and try anything. But the millennial still has this idea that it's got to be planned. I'm waiting for the right thing,
Mhm.
right?
Very strategic.
Which is not always a great strategy, right?
Mhm.
But sometimes the Xer attitude was a lot more productive. Do
Yeah.
anything as long as you're engaged, and then see where that goes.
Yeah, absolutely. I was speaking to somebody at UT Austin recently, and they were saying their entrepreneurship class had taken off. So attendance for these entrepreneurship classes and how to really create your own path are just blowing through the roof.
Well, I think it's obvious that when you can't get a job, work on personal branding,
Right.
And try to get your name out. Try to become someone who's creating value in your own right, under your own name. I will say, let me just say from the perspective of older generations, that the very notion of an entrepreneurship class or credential is an oxymoron.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
a contradiction of terms, and
Yeah.
I think that's another big generational shift. For a boomer, for an early wave Xer, to be an entrepreneur meant to do that to the system.
Right.
It meant not to have a credential. It meant to say goodbye to your parents, take out some little hovel, take out some little garret or a garage, work on your own thing, follow your own genius. If you build it, they will come, right?
Mm-hmm.
And never to do this with the idea that this is a safe credential that you could show someone. That's
Yeah.
not the point. And one thing that's fascinating with millennials is that their idea of entrepreneuring is networking, getting your parents involved, getting the community involved. It's very, it's not particularly risk averse. It's lost a lot of its edginess, and and it doesn't have that severe individualism that so much of the, when Steve Jobs, that's a great example.
Right.
I think great boomer entrepreneurs, or even Xer entrepreneurs that, year after year you saw them in Fortune magazine's top 40 under 40.
Mm-hmm.
They look edgy, they look mean, their shirts were kind of open and they would have chains and things, they didn't, these guys looked like they had made personal commitments, they stuck through it thin and thin. We see millennials who do this as just much more other directed, much more wanting to help not only themselves but kind of their circle of people that they know.
Yeah. Absolutely, and there's something interesting about the fact that a lot of entrepreneurship is focusing on digital businesses. So Mark Zuckerberg, having sold Facebook and built it, is kind of like telling this generation that your idea, your digital idea, what this behavior you think is so valuable is not being met by older generations, could be worth $1 billion in an online space. All you have to do is make it.
Right. Yeah.
So there's something really cool there. So, over thinking about the past year or so, what's been something really interesting that you've learned about millennials, that you've come across or that you've seen that's just kind of given you a spark of inspiration?
Well, so many things. One thing we just did a piece on for our online periodical, Social Intelligence, is young adult fiction and social action.
The $1 million question.
Oh my gosh! But it started with Harry Potter and sort of the whole Harry Potter coalition, and then it went. We saw Twilight get involved in a very different way, and then of course now with the Hunger Games.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fascinating. First of all, there's just so many things that are new about it. First of all, the whole idea of young adult fiction, of having people in this age bracket devour these huge books. We remember back in the Harry Potter era where it started with kids. And they're all reading this thing. There's the idea of achievement. These big books, you're reading them, you master this complex plot and all the stuff that's going on. And the more complex and challenging it is, the bigger the group that follows it, right?
Yeah.
They're action-oriented. These are not introspective stories. They're stories about heroes, heroines, and a small bands that sort of triumph over evil. This is inherently kind of an outer world story told out through history. A lot of boomers like myself, we remember reading books like Jonathan Livingston Seagull and stuff where the transformation was internal. I come to a new realization of how I ought to see the world, right?
Yeah.
And that makes me feel better. There's very little of that in millennial fiction. It is epic. It is outer world epic, history changing stuff.
It's also very empowering, like Harry Potter, being able to have this power in his bedroom and take off to this other land and be this hero, and at the end of the day he's kind of just this nerdy little kid with glasses, but the fact that could exist in anybody.
Well, and there's a lot of that, as you know, in the TV shows and so on, a lot of that sudden transformation, understanding your power to change the world. And then this connection with social action. I mean, isn't that amazing? Now with Hunger Games and Oxfam and a lot of the other movements that have gathered force around this, but this is also new. And I think it's something that may well spread to other forms of entertainment. But to harness that, you need to keep in mind sort of the ingredients of a millennial epic. You probably we ought to think about the 10 things you have to do to come up with the next millennial epic and sort of write them down.
And, what territory has come before. You said that it's about understanding your power. So Harry Potter was about understanding your power in this way. But then Twilight came around, and that was almost about controlling your power.
Exactly. Controlling your power. And it was, it's a little bit of the sort of, sort of more of a red zone epic. It's sort of a blue zone epic.
Right.
But, because it had to do with much more sort of traditional morality, someone from another century, and could people abide by this kind of code and control their own passion? There's been actually a lot of Xers and boomers who've written about how all the aggression and danger has been taken out of vampires. I mean, whatever happened to your deadly vampire? Now they're actually good.
Good haircuts.
Right.
Yeah.
Haircuts. But I mean, in other words, it's controlling it in a beneficial way ultimately. Clearly different context for Twilight.
So it's realizing your power, controlling your power. Now Hunger Games just came out.
Yeah.
And we're all hearing it.
Well, first of all, think of the mood of the movie.
Right.
Where does the scenery come from? It comes from the 1930s. It's all either echoes of the New Deal and the Great Depression, or some are saying some of it echoes sort of National Socialist sort of sort of Nuremberg rally
districts.
Right.
Absolutely.
But it's interesting when you think of how the 30s have come back as a theme and motif in sort of American cultural life in the past few years. Obviously echoing, this recession we've had.
So
and then think about one thing, because I know we were talking about a little bit earlier, and that is, think about this, that the greatest horror or the greatest nightmare for these young people is a world in which they're forced to kill each other, right? A world of cutthroat young adult competition.
Yeah.
So I threw out the idea that in some sense this was a metaphor for millennials being thrown into a young adult world that's been shaped by Gen Xers, right?
Right.
Total competition, free agency, no safety nets, and kind of your Jack Welch corporate philosophy, fire 10% of everyone every year, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And one of the things we've noticed in the workplace about millennials, everyone notices that, even boomers who otherwise may not like them, is that they really help each other at the workplace. They're wonderful team players. When I started out working, we didn't know whether we ought to help people our own age. And so we were kind of competing. Yeah, they were kind of our buddies, but we were also competing. You don't notice that. Millennials really do, try to benefit each other. And I think I think that that's sort of an interesting. I was thinking about the Hunger Games, doing
Yeah.
this.
But that and you're absolutely right, the Jack Welch mentality, that fire 10% of your workforce every year. And part of what that whole story is about is that they're trying to overthrow the people instituting those rules. And
Right.
so millennials in a Gen X built world, there's something interesting.
And your sense of community that doesn't depend upon to incentivize people that kind of, competition. So, a lot of interesting sub-themes in that.
Absolutely. Yeah, which, this idea of millennials now, so we focus primarily on them as being youth. And now we're looking at a point in time when they're going, if you look at the bell-shaped curve, from being youth to young adults. And there was a lot of excitement around, okay, look what millennials did to the music industry. As they came into it, they reshaped it, they retooled it, they made it more about peer-to-peer, and they totally broke the business model. So now here they are, they're entering young adulthood in the masses. What's a millennial adult world look like? We talked a lot about work. How about education? Let's start there. A millennial classroom. Looking down the road 25 years from now, what do you think we'd see?
Well, one of the things we're going to have to see, and we're going to have to see it soon, is a much more efficient, less costly, and effective system of education.
Right.
And one of the reasons why millennials have so much debt right now is that we continue to throw more money at them to compete for the same number of elite higher education spots, right? I'm waiting for the team of a Xer entrepreneur and millennial techies to design a kind of University of Phoenix 2.0, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Where it would truly pipe in all the best stuff freely or cheaply.
Mm-hmm.
It would provide the one-on-one sort of contact, again, in a much more efficient manner, and you wouldn't have to go to some, establishment with a $16 billion trust, endowment fund to learn this stuff. Anyone could do it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's end runs around the regulations which keep post-secondary education from offering that, along with the use of technology to bring everything to everyone's to bring everyone to everyone's fingertips. I think the other thing you'll need for millennials is some sense of in-person civic participation. I don't think that millennials ever want to do education totally at a distance. They do want to participate together, but.
So you think there would be a timeless need, that we could never see classrooms go totally away, that millennials in their very nature, that just wouldn't quite be them, and that we're always going to see a place for classrooms and getting together and being part of this?
Well, that gets at actually the whole question, not just the classroom, but the workplace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How's it going to look different? In our book, Millennials in the Workplace, we already pointed out what many architectural firms are now saying, and the cubicle is dead, or it's at least being rapidly replaced by a return to the open bullpen workplace, where you have large spaces where people can collaborate, maybe slight separations where groups can be a little bit apart. When you think of the campus at Nike or Google or any of these places, you think of large open spaces, and you think of places that look like mom and dad's family room. You know what I mean? They're very comfortable.
They have couches and video games.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of nice, and you like to hang out there. And people sometimes say, I point that out to the C-suite, and they may think of themselves as some manufacturing organization. And then I point out, well, that's what Nike is. It depends how you see yourself. But then I point out, is this spoiling them? In other words, you prepare a place like this, and you prepare an atmosphere like this, and you get the best and brightest of this generation to spend 10-hour days working for you. Mm-hmm. It's a bargain. It's a bargain to do this. And the key is to allow millennials to make believe that this is just like their home.
Mm-hmm.
So that they don't have that work, the whole business about Gen Xers, work-life balance, right? Work-life balance. Doesn't that sound pathetic, that you have to balance? It's like one thing I hate, one thing I like, so my whole life is about balancing, the half of it I hate.
Yeah.
So why not just make the workplace kind of friendly like your own life, and allow you to do some personal things while you're there to keep your life going?
So just be you, and management will leverage the talent of the team.
Yeah.
Well, around that topic is, so if millennials were raised with this sense of specialness and the individuality, and you are special. So if you put them in an open floor setting, I mean, how do those two ideas clash? So now if it's all like, okay, there's a flat hierarchy, how do you manage millennials so they can still be, motivated to do better, to get promoted, and to stand out from the group, but also contribute to the group?
There's always a tension, and I agree that it has to be handled a little bit more delicately when Gen Xers like to think each of them has their own custom relationship with the employer, right? And so you can advance all on very different tracks. And it was ideal for a flat organization because it meant that there had to be no necessary path. Whoever you needed could instantly be given the promotion. I think with the millennials that's much harder because one of the things we know from millennials is that millennials like to have a much clearer sense of what the rules say about how you can advance, and maybe not advance up the salary ladder and hierarchy, as also advancing sideways, just getting constantly being given new kinds of tasks within an employer. But they need rules. They need to know if I'm here for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, where do I go? And where's my next, right? Not just this is uncharted, and whenever I feel a creative heat, they will, which 10, 15 years ago in the late 90s, that's how the hottest corporations are selling themselves to Gen Xers, right? We're going to give you this environment, and you can sort of be your own, me incorporated, and go anywhere you want when you feel like it.
Right.
This is not the millennial style.
Right.
So, I think there is a tension there.
I would also guess that big companies are going to have to rethink their promoting strategy. So, for example, in an organizational setting like that, if you're going to promote one individual, then you better have a plan to promote someone near them and near them shortly after, or promote everybody at the same time versus losing talent.
Exactly. Well, promote at the same time is ideal because increasingly millennials are being hired in teams. I mean, look at the Army now. They have the buddy bonus, and you can join in groups now. And I think that
you're plus one in the Army.
What?
You're plus one.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
You're plus one. The idea of for instance, getting group incentives. So your whole team, right, can rise with each person's performance. And look, I mean, I think that millennials have inevitably a healthy degree of cynicism about team grading, right? I mean, they all know, well, what about the person who really did do all the work? But there are ways of ferreting that out, and you can have a system where what they do in a lot of colleges, where each member of the team grades each other, so you get a sense of who really did do the work, right? So not only does the team get a grade, but you also take into account the team grading each other. But there are ways of balancing this, and I think the healthy side of it is you get rid of that that kind of predatory nightmare that we're talking about.
Right, absolutely. I think it's interesting you talked about how if there's clear rules to success and a clear path to success, that's the best structure for them. So if it's like, you're saying if you accomplish this, this, and this, you will get promoted. And that's particularly useful with millennials.
Yeah. It's also because it's achievement oriented. And so you have all the time these boomers, and especially Xers, say, I can't stand these overconfident, they want my job. They want my job in 3 weeks. That's kind of their attitude. And they become defensive. No, you go over there and just do photocopies. You have to pay your dues. It's kind of like you have to do all this crappy stuff for a year before you can be, rather than saying, here's what you have to perform. It's not a question of time. Yeah. Here are the 17 extremely difficult things you have to learn. I'll do everything I can to help you learn them. And if you want to spend 18-hour days learning it, more power to you. That energizes millennials, and I do know that we've consulted a lot with the armed services, and one of the problems the Army, for example, has in recruiting millennial talent, particularly who want to stay for the long term and become an officer, is, as you know, the Army is, if there's one doctrine which underlies everything the Army does, it's seniority. You just have to be there for a certain amount of time until you can be, doesn't matter how good you are.
Right.
To a lot of millennials, that's just, no, it just can't be like that.
So where's the opportunity to kind of reshape that, to millennialize it, if you will?
Well, is to you still want a path, but you want it, and you want some of the path to be based on time. For instance, being reassigned to a task. But when it comes to moving up in levels of responsibility and perhaps to some extent pay, the seniority is defined in terms of time, in terms of achievement. Now, this is a very achievement-oriented generation. Just look at how many of them now are all going and getting their advanced placement tests, or getting all these tests for graduate schools they never will go to, but they just want to know how they score.
Yeah.
It's like a giant video game. It's
Exactly. Which was the video game idea. You talked about leveling up and clear rules, and there's been so much talk, in the past year about the gamification of marketing. This idea that if you can kind of infuse competition and rules is the best new practice for marketing campaigns. What's your take on that?
I think it's great.
Yeah?
Yeah. You make it fun. I mean, there are people in the video game industry naturally who say that in 20 years, your interaction with every institution is going to be a video game.
Yeah.
It's going to be a game. Whether it's your bank, whether it's your taxes, whether it's everything, it's going to be made like a game.
Yeah.
You're going to have options, and you're going to have to,
Absolutely.
weigh them.
It's funny, there was almost like, there was this big buzz around crowdsourcing a couple years ago, and then it went to gamification of marketing, which is kind of the same thing. It's just with more potential for achievement tacked onto it. So it'll be interesting to see what our next frontier is there. I want to talk about military for a second. I know you do some interesting stuff with the military. I'm curious what your thoughts are on how a generation that has seen Iraq and Afghanistan wars, how have they impacted those wars? So how, if at all, have how those wars been particularly millennial and the training and recruitment and what's happening over there?
Well, first of all, my impression is that the senior officers, right now from major through colonel, maybe through 1-star, those are all Xers. The great thing about generations in the military is that rank lines up perfectly with age, so you can tell exactly where you are.
Yeah.
So the boomers are all the older generals, and then you've got through the captains are all your millennials. So, but I would say first of all, the older generations truly admire millennials, and I've seen that, I've heard that again and again from senior officers about the patience, intelligence, loyalty, endurance. I mean, they're truly valued out there. In many ways, it's the opposite of what you used to hear in Vietnam, where senior officers really had a very hard time with boomers, who were fragging each other. I mean, it was a very, and also not managing them well, constant rotations, which were very disorienting to young soldiers. And I was recently in an event with the Illinois National Guard, talking to all of their sort of mid-level officers, Xers, and they said, yeah, there are things about millennials we don't like or that we have trouble with, and most of all is the fact that they consider millennials so sheltered. So, for instance, they just don't know they don't come in knowing how to use a shovel or read a map or fix a carburetor, all the things that an older generation learned or were on their own, fixing their own problems a lot more. So that aspect of millennials is a problem. And you talk to people in basic training and, obesity and stress fractures, this generation, millennials do not have a healthy relationship with physical activity. But on the other hand, they said, these kids, what it's like in the National Guard, these are given constant tours of duty, in the Middle East and dangerous duty. And they can't believe it. They said, when we joined the National Guard, back in the 80s and 90s, it was all about, a party once a week and free tuition, and that's why we did it.
Right.
We can't believe that these kids do this voluntarily. I mean, they're just astounded at their dedication.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing. The other thing to remember is this is a small portion of the millennial generation. This is not a broad cross-section. This is not like Korea or Vietnam was for the silent generation or boomers. And there's Paul Taylor at the Pew Research Institute. He has a good line, which is a little bit funny. I think it's sort of says it all. He says, yeah, he said, these millennials, they're really a service generation, community service and all these things. But when it comes to the armed forces, they're more of a thank you for your service generation.
That's
they're,
perfect.
they're very appreciative, but most of them don't themselves want to do it.
Right, which is actually, you had an interesting note on how basic training has changed.
Right.
So if it used to be about breaking down the recruit, how has it evolved to meet the new normal?
Well, yeah, I mean, with boomers and Xers, the assumption was you had a selfish individual who maybe they're joining the army because they didn't like themselves much anyway, right? So the idea was break them down and remake them. You remember that famous ad in 1990 with the steel, reforged, and the sword comes out all shiny and hard, and very gladiatorial too. Those ads back in the early 90s for the Marines. And the first thing that happened when you were driven on the bus was a drill sergeant would come and scream at you, you maggot, you're worse than useless, right? All of that.
Right.
Now, because these new millennial doctrines have percolated up, not just at USAREC, which is the recruitment center, but now at TRADOC, which is training and indoctrination. They're put in place in the basic training, so that when the bus comes up, they get all the kids come out of the bus, they line them up, and the drill sergeant thanks them for volunteering at a time of war. Okay, that is a big shift, along with a lot of other shifts we're seeing. Probably the most conspicuous of which is how closely now the armed forces are co-marketing to the parents, and they're bringing the parents very early in on the process. In the good old days, they weren't really good old days, maybe bad old days. The Marines, they like nothing better than to find a kid who hated their parents and talk to them separately and to get them to join. Leave my horrible parents. They never do that now. There's actually a rule in the Marines that you do not have more than one communication with a high school or college student without talking to the parents before talking to them again.
Really?
Because they've had too many buyer's remorse, parents just going crazy, suing them, just causing all kinds of problems.
Yeah.
So, we're in a different age when it comes to parental attachment.
And I'd have to imagine that the pitch to parents must be different these days. That if it used to be about targeting the individual and saying,
go out and do something dangerous,
and now
like be wild.
Yeah. Now there's got to be a cleaner version of that.
Yeah. Well, it has to be how this prepares you for life, and the connections and all of this. One angle on it, I've always thought would be very interesting, particularly given the millennials' problems with a healthy lifestyle. I mean, in terms of exercise and all of that, is to really push that angle and talk about how a healthy lifestyle regimen that the armed forces gives a young man or a young woman, in terms of lifetime survival odds, totally outweighs the risk of death or injury in combat. Think about it. And I've always thought you could even, I've suggested to them, I bet you could statistically confirm that you've actually increased that person's longevity by that kind of training.
Yeah, and chance of having a healthy lifestyle. That's really interesting. All right, let's switch gears for a second. We have about 15 minutes left, I think.
Okay.
Let's talk about politics.
Let's.
We have to hit it.
Okay.
There's going to be a lot of focus on this upcoming campaign and what's going to happen. I know the $1 million question, which we can't answer today, but what do you think we can expect to see based on what we know is important to them when Obama was first elected? We saw that turn out. Now as we look towards the second wave of that, we know what's happened or what hasn't happened. Participation. Any thoughts?
Well, this is what all of the survey people are saying, and they're saying that from expectations now that compared to 2008, participation and enthusiasm will be down in under age 30, and it will be up over age 50 or over age 60.
Really? So down?
Yeah, down. We are not going to see the same voter participation rates. Unless things change dramatically. I mean, we still haven't, we still have a whole campaign to go. The campaign really hasn't started yet. there just isn't the same vibe there. I mean, you know, Obama hasn't really realized the millennials' expectations, and he's running for a second term. You know, how motivated can you ever get for a second term? I think the only time where we actually saw an acceleration in motivation for a second term, interestingly enough, was FDR running in 36, actually got a bigger majority and in some sense whipped people up more, young people up more in 36 and 32. Will we see that? I don't know. Now we're not seeing it in the polls. I will also say this, that of all the candidates that the Republicans, you know, of all the ones that were sort of in the race and that had a chance, the Republicans probably chose the most competitive candidate from millennial voters. And one thing we noticed in all the primaries, Gingrich and Santorum would always hugely outdo Romney over age 50, but that Romney would always beat the values candidates, the culture war candidates under age 30.
Right.
And of course that's just consistent with everything we know.
Right. And you know, millennials have a notoriously short attention span, right? So for this generation, is 8 years long enough to perceive that change could still happen, or after 4 years are they going to kind of throw in the towel and look at another candidate? Would be interesting.
Well, I think they'll look at Romney, and I think that, you know, right now Romney's kind of beaten and battered, and in my opinion, the GOP brand has really been hammered and tarnished by the primary. I think it's done them no good at all.
And pop culture, frankly.
Yeah, but you know, all of those various debates, you know, for a while people would think, well, that's great, you know, they're you know, actually getting out and they're talking with each other. But I think the long-term effect has been to sort of bolster Obama by comparison. But I will say, I think Romney's one chance is that he can make a fresh start. I still think most Americans don't really know him. And Obama doesn't have that. They already know it. At least whatever they think about it is not going to change that much. But Romney's still an unknown. And I think it's going to be, I think the debates are going to be very interesting. Yeah, you could say it's a shame that we won't have Gingrich and Obama debating each other. That would have been pay-for-view stuff, right? It would have been like the Thrilla in Manila. You know, you would have paid to watch that, right? But I think these are going to be very, very mannerly, polite. I think you can expect a high level of discourse in terms of discussion of policy between the two. In a way, they're actually temperamentally similar. They're both very sort of cool, detached, right? Both Romney and Obama. It's going to be sort of interesting.
Absolutely. Well, I want to open up the opportunity for questions for our listeners.
Yes.
And for our viewers. So, Michelle, are you still with us? Do we have any questions?
I am, and we've had a couple questions come in on our Mega Mashup Twitter stream. The first, actually, on that political note, is from Mike. Neil Howe, how do you view or reconcile the Occupy Wall Street and the Ron Paul millennial?
Well, those are both really good questions, and we've looked into both of them. The Ron Paul phenomenon has been interesting, both because he gets, you know, he's a bimodal distribution. I mean, he gets some sort of on the left and some on the right. He gets people on the right that, you know, really don't like all of this millennial community stuff, right? Looking for a more libertarian America. And he gets people on the left that just that don't like Obama because of all the stuff he's doing abroad and the predator strikes, and he's still in Afghanistan. You know, we're doing all kinds of horrible things abroad. So he gets these two people, these two groups. Most of the data I see show that millennials actually are highly approving of Obama's foreign policy. They like the multilateralism, they like the soft power, they don't want to disengage with the rest of the world, which is, in other words, there's a fundamental disagreement with Ron Paul, the idea that all America needs is one Trident nuclear submarine, just to sit off. Otherwise we could bring all American troops out. I don't think that's where millennials are, okay, on that question. The Occupy Wall Street is fascinating because we actually we looked very closely at polls, one done by Quinnipiac College, and a number of them done. They didn't get a lot of press, to really parse the age bracket support. And one of the things we found, to our surprise, even after, late fall was setting in and the temperature was getting colder, is that I was amazed at the very large share of millennials who didn't even know about Occupy Wall Street. Much larger share than older age brackets. Boomers were like twice as likely to know about it.
Really?
And even though boomers were those who knew about it, the boomers were less likely to support it. The absolute share of all boomers who supported it was actually larger than millennials.
Really?
Because so many millennials didn't even know about it.
Yeah.
I think part of the problem with Occupy Wall Street was that it had its roots in very kind of boomer Xer era kind of symbolic street theater stuff. I mean, it was very much kind of the new left of that era. And, the Guy Fawkes mask, well, just think of the Guy Fawkes. I mean, the guy was a terrorist, right? He wanted to blow up Parliament.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking of looking at millennials and their view of change as being constructive, right? Building, doing things that not necessarily kill your opponent, but maybe work with corporations and do something constructive to bring the country together again. And I think the unfortunate thing about Occupy Wall Street was that it was, the organizers wanted it as a very counterculture, no organization, no agenda. Do you remember famously the ads were like, we're not in favor of anything, just bring your tent, that kind of.
Yeah.
I think millennials want something more constructive, more positive, more structured, more accountable. But I will say this, that if millennials wanted to, they could easily reshape that movement in their own image. And I think that the key is that once temperatures start going up, right? Once spring hits and once people like to be outside, how will millennials eventually take control of that movement away from the anarchist and the black shirt people, that go to Rome and Milan, go everywhere else? Will they kind of take it and reshape it more in their own image?
That's interesting. That's interesting. That's great. Thanks, Michelle. Any others on there?
All right, so our next question is, how critical is it to market to the parents of millennials?
Ooh, good question.
Well, I've been preaching that for a long time. I think it's critical. You've seen what, I think I talked a little bit here about what the armed forces are doing. Let me put it this way. The more a product or service involves a serious life choice or a serious risk, the more the millennial is likely to talk it over with their parents anyway, and the more the parent is going to take an active interest in it. We see, for example, one of the most remarkable things we're seeing in the workplace is millennials taking a greater interest in benefits, fringe benefits, things like retirement, health care, relocation services, tax prep, all this stuff. They take a greater interest in it than do Xers in their 40s.
Mm-hmm.
What explains that? Well, partly it's that the millennials are talking to their parents on their cell phone every night, right? And their parents are telling you, "Oh, make sure you ask about that. Make sure you're plugged into those services." The other thing we saw is that millennials are more anxious about insecurity, and they want these benefits to protect. They want to know that there's an employer that's actually looking after them, that's not just offering things they can take or deny. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a basic generational distinction. Xers trusted themselves to decide what they needed. Millennials want someone who's actually trying to look out for them 360. But again, you can see how naturally the parents come into those decisions. Now, if it's something that doesn't involve risk or a big life decision, things like clothes or consumer electronics, it's less important. Although even consumer electronics, you have the parental connection because they're often communicating with their parents with their cell phone, which is the reason the rise of the whole family-oriented cell phone plan. Which, by the way, when cell phones were first introduced, they didn't have this. People didn't even know that. Yeah. 10 years ago, that was a discovery by phone company, by wireless companies. And as for things like iPods, I'll just tell you, I go around asking people about the iPod overlap in their family. And most people in their 50s and most teens say the same thing. 20, 30, even 40% sing songs on their iPod with their parents.
Right, the overlap there
Isn't
is incredible.
isn't that amazing?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks, Michelle. I think we have time for one more, and then we'll wrap it up here.
Okay, so our next question that came in was, how will the millennials be different in their choosing of spouses and in their parenting?
Oh, that's good.
Wow, that's a real good question. Well, we did a piece recently on millennial moms. Okay, that's the big new buzzword, millennial moms. I think it's because the alliteration, it just kind of comes off the tongue, millennial moms.
Yeah, two M's.
And let me just quickly say, we don't know the answer yet because millennial moms are still pretty sociodemographically skewed, because a lot of those who will become millennial moms tend to be a little bit more affluent and college educated, so it's a little bit skewed. But what the data that we did look at shows that the millennial moms are, more than older moms, really into being moms. I mean, it's like really important to them that they're a mom. For instance, they don't like to be away from their family as much. They regard their role as organizing and providing for their family to be really definitional in their lives. Whereas the boomer moms are kind of like, I'm a mom, so But that's it. We're going to learn a lot more about them when a broader cross-section of this population of millennial women have kids, and how they're going to raise their kids. I think initially they're going to be protective, which is the way Xers are raising their kids now. I think, though, our very long-term prediction, kind of our long cyclical prediction, is that later in life, particularly late-wave millennial moms, will begin to sort of relax again. There's going to be a little bit more permissive and wide-open childhood for them.
Interesting. Well, cool. Thank you so much, Neil. It's always great chatting with you.
Great to be here.
Cool. And guys, thanks for tuning in. Hopefully we'll see you in Miami at the Ypulse IIR Millennial Mega Mashup. Thanks for joining. Take care.